National Preservation Month, and joining me this morning to share is celebrity historian Raffi Andonian, and you're going to give us information. I mean, gosh, you were a park ranger. You know, you've got a lot of information on this. So who better to talk to?
I do, and look, speaking of my past experience, I even brought my master's degree in historic preservation. It hangs out as a little roll. That's right. One of my degrees is in historic preservation, so it was a wonderful month to have this degree.
Yes, right. This is the month for you, Raffi. All right, so let's talk about, for people who are, what is historic preservation?
Preservation we often think of is, you know, in a capsule as if frozen in time, but that's not necessarily the case. It is often, you know, not just museums, but it could be a district or a home or a business that is in sort of a historic building that's actively used today. Of course, for example, you have the historic Greenwood district, which has not just the museum, but a series of businesses that creates a whole environment and community around it. So it's not necessarily something that's just a museum, but of course also in historic preservation, we think of historic sites, for example. The National Park Service, where I have had experience, is one of the places that we think of it. Now, there you go. There's a photo of me looking like, I am as a park ranger, not just looking at one, but as a park ranger at the Gettysburg and various Civil War sites that I worked at. I worked at Gettysburg Battlefield, Civil War sites around Richmond. There we are gathered on the battlefield at Gettysburg with a bunch of visitors. There I am next to a cannon, a Civil War cannon with a couple of visitors. So, you know, when you think of the National Park Service, you think of sites, right? Yeah. Here in Oklahoma, for example, there's in Oklahoma City the memorial to the Oklahoma City bombing. That is actually a National Park Service site. There's also the Washita Battlefield. Speaking of battlefields, different war, of course, from the Great Plains Wars. But see, there's more on the battlefield. There I am, all over the place. Wow. But also the National Park Service doesn't just do sites. We also have, for example, tax incentives and grant programs to give to recognize historic properties, which don't have to be government property. The private properties we talk about, but maybe on the National Register, which is something the National Park Service runs. And they give money to help restore those buildings and or after a disaster to help restore them and even do research. Why does research matter so much? Well, let's look at an example in our hands right here. This is papyrus. That's the ancient Egyptian paper made out of the papyrus plant. Brought this from Egypt. My mom is from Egypt and went to Egypt and brought this back. This is the ancient paper. And so think about something like this, preserving this. When the National Park Service does research, let's look at something like this. I have seen an example at a historic society where someone working on this sort of preservation had a background in both art history and chemistry. Do you see how that might be helpful here? Because art history helps you understand it and chemistry helps you understand the material to actually preserve it.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's not just history that folks are majoring in. There's all these different avenues.
Related aspects to it. That's right.
I have to say my favorite is the George Washington Carver National Monument. I went there when I worked in Joplin, so that was my favorite place.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's tons of wonderful stuff.
Another local spot too.
Right.
So was historic preservation a thing in historic times?
Yes, it was a thing. George Washington himself, actually, his property was endangered, and there's a famous story with the Mount Vernon Ladies Memorial Association that came together and preserved it, but that wasn't always the case. For example, John Hancock, the big signature on Declaration of Independence, his home was destroyed. And when his home was destroyed, there was this big uproar in the 19th century about what kind of country are we? Are we going to look for, you know, are we doing commercial real estate or identity that we're preserving for the future? There's always this debate. And even in the Midwest, when as East Coasters came to the Midwest and found these old mounds, they actually took a lot of pride in finding these Native American mounds because they said this is evidence of ancient civilization, ancient America, that we can contend with Europe. So preservation was actually a thing even back in the day, a couple hundred years ago. And I would like to tie it here to Oklahoma because preservation has been a thing in Oklahoma for many decades as well. So for example, in Tulsa, we have the Tulsa Historical Society, which has more than 400,000 objects. So these kinds of things that we're talking about may not be from ancient Egypt, but 400,000 objects that they're preserving. Or the Oklahoma Historical Society, which has a markers program that you may find all over the state. There's also the Tulsa Preservation Commission. So if you want a local resource for your property to go and find out how to protect your personal home, you can actually turn to the Tulsa Preservation Commission, but it's not just in Tulsa. There's also Preservation Oklahoma that does these things statewide, even provides workshops and education, because when all this research is being done, even by the National Park Service, which is federal, organizations like this pick up on that research and they bring it back into the local community to be able to provide services that and information for you to work on your property. And as we talked about, it has been a thing across for a couple of centuries, and it's not just about the past, because as the debate was about George Washington and John Hancock back in the day, the question wasn't, what do we just do with these properties? But it was a question of, what stories are we protecting to tell future generations? So it was really a way of managing the stories we tell about ourselves to the future. So when we think of preservation, don't just think of the past, think of your present and what you're projecting into the future.
That is a great kind of motto to think about, not just, of course, with sites and historic facts, but our lives as well, even with our own homes.
That's right. Your homes, your downtown, your businesses, the beautiful commercial buildings that sometimes are changing over and having different businesses and different groups in them at different times. Absolutely. It's a way to think of it as active. And again, the stories that we tell about the future, it's about our identities, because we decide what we select from the past to tell in the future.
I love that. Raffi, thank you so much for joining us today. To find out more about Raffi Andonian, head on over to celebrityhistorian.com.